What if the man who started this war isn't actually trying to win it anymore, but is only trying to survive it long enough to see how it eventually ends? Because right now, inside Russia, the banks are quietly rationing withdrawals, the refineries keep catching fire faster than they can be rebuilt, and Vladimir Putin just did something reckless enough to shake the entire NATO alliance to its core. Before we go further, hit subscribe right now, because this video is going to connect a burning refinery in Russia's interior to a missile that just crossed into Polish airspace. And once you see how those two things are actually linked, you'll understand exactly why Moscow is starting to panic. Hit like too, share this with someone who still thinks this war is going Russia's way. And let's get into it. For a long time, this war followed a familiar rhythm. Small advances measured in kilometers, grinding trench fighting a front line that barely moved for months at a stretch. To a lot of outside observers, it looked like a stalemate that could drag on forever with no real path to an ending. But underneath that surface, something else has been quietly building. While the world stayed fixed on the trenches, Ukraine has been developing a completely different kind of capability, one that has nothing to do with capturing land at all. Let's start with the fires, because they tell you almost everything you need to know about where this war is actually heading. For months now, Ukraine has been quietly scaling up something most people underestimated. Not a new army, not a new tank division, a new class of weapon that doesn't need soldiers, doesn't need fuel convoys, and doesn't need permission from anyone outside its own borders. Long-range drones and missiles built inside Ukraine, flying deep into Russian territory, hitting the one thing Vladimir Putin genuinely cannot protect no matter how hard he tries: his money. Because a war doesn't run on soldiers alone. It runs on oil. It runs on steel. It runs on factories that never stop, and banks that keep lending, and a government that can still pay its bills. And that's exactly what Ukraine has started quietly dismantling, piece by piece, refinery by refinery, warehouse by warehouse. Let's talk numbers, because they're genuinely hard to ignore once you actually sit down and look at them closely. Russia operates around 24 major oil refineries, processing millions of barrels of crude every single day. That's the beating heart of the entire Russian war machine. Oil pays for missiles. Oil pays for soldiers. Oil pays for the state television broadcasts that keep ordinary Russians convinced this war is worth fighting. Ukrainian drones have now hit a substantial share of that refining capacity, and at points this year, a huge portion of Russia's normal refining output has been knocked offline in a single stretch. Recent strikes have continued reaching refineries and air bases deep inside Russian territory, hundreds of kilometers past the border, in places that 3 years ago nobody would have believed a Ukrainian weapon could ever reach. And here's the part that should genuinely worry the Kremlin. Ukraine isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. What once required striking near the border is now happening in facilities far into Russia's interior, hitting refineries, radar systems, and even the air bases that house the strategic bombers used to launch missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. This isn't random destruction. It's targeted, patient, and devastatingly cost-effective. Just recently, Ukrainian forces confirmed strikes on a refinery deep in Russia's Saratov region, alongside a hit on an airbase home to some of Russia's long-range strategic bombers, the very same aircraft repeatedly used to launch missile barrages against Ukrainian civilians. Around the same time, separate strikes hit oil refineries and radar systems scattered across the country. None of this is a single dramatic night. It's a rolling, near-constant campaign, one that keeps forcing Russian officials to admit damage they'd clearly rather keep quiet. And the cost math here should terrify any finance minister sitting in Moscow. A single Ukrainian long-range drone can cost a fraction of what it costs to build the facility. It destroys. That's not a fair trade. That's a losing exchange. Repeated over and over again, week after week. Now picture the position Russia is actually in. It spans 11 time zones. You cannot realistically put enough air defense around every refinery, every warehouse, every fuel depot across a country that enormous. Something always slips through, and Ukraine only needs a handful of successful strikes each month to keep bleeding the Russian economy dry. There's also a hidden cost that rarely gets talked about, the cost of defending against attacks that never even land. Every time Russian air defense detects an incoming drone, even one that gets intercepted, the response still isn't free. Sirens sound, airports shut down, factories pause. Interceptor missiles, some costing more than the drone they're shooting down, get fired into the sky. Multiply that across dozens of alerts every single week, and you start to see how even a failed attack still drains money and resources from a system that's already stretched thin. Meanwhile, Ukraine's production keeps growing. Domestic manufacturers are scaling up long-range missile output significantly, building weapons capable of flying well over 1,000 kilometers and carrying substantial warheads. Russia simply doesn't have an easy way to match that pace, and everyone inside the Kremlin knows it. So, if you've heard certain voices insisting Russia is winning this war, ask yourself, honestly, are they looking at the actual numbers, or are they just repeating a talking point? Because the battlefield of factories, fuel, and finance is telling a very different story than the one showing up in some headlines. Think about how different this war looks compared to a few years ago. Back then, most people pictured tanks rolling across open fields, soldiers digging into trenches, slow grinding battles measured in meters of ground. That image isn't wrong. The trenches are still there. The front lines are still brutal. But it's incomplete. The most decisive battles of this war are increasingly happening far away from any front line at all. They're happening in refinery control rooms, in shipping manifests, in bank ledgers, and in the quiet panic of executives trying to figure out how to keep a company solvent after its warehouse burns to the ground. This is what modern warfare actually looks like right now. You don't need to occupy a city to break its economy. A single drone, built for a fraction of the cost of the target it destroys, can achieve what an entire army division once needed months to accomplish. Every one of these strikes is calculated. Ukrainian planners are studying supply chains, tracing which refineries feed which military units, identifying which warehouses double as logistics hubs for the war effort. This is economic warfare executed with real precision, and it's forcing Russia into a position that no amount of state media coverage can fully hide. That story gets even darker once you look past the refineries and straight into the Russian financial system itself. This next part is honestly one of the more fascinating threads running through this entire war. So if you've made it this far, do one simple thing. Share this video with one person who still thinks Russia's economy is untouchable. It takes 5 seconds, and it genuinely helps push the real story further than the propaganda does. Let's talk about a company called Wildberries. If you're not familiar with it, think of it as Russia's version of a massive online shopping platform, something like Amazon, woven deeply into everyday Russian life. Millions of people use it to buy clothes, electronics, and household goods. Tens of thousands of small sellers depend on it for their entire income. But Wildberries was never just a shopping app. Its enormous warehouse network was also reportedly being used to support Russian military logistics, listing goods that Ukraine says double as equipment for the front line, which made it, in the eyes of Ukrainian planners, a legitimate target. In recent weeks alone, more than a dozen Wildberries facilities have been struck by Ukrainian drones, from warehouses near St. Petersburg to depots more than 1,000 kilometers from the border in the Urals. Fires have broken out at multiple sites in quick succession. Workers evacuated, firefighters deployed by the hundreds, regional governors forced to publicly confirm the damage. This wasn't one isolated strike. It was a sustained campaign, hitting the same company again and again until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Think about what it actually means for a strike campaign to keep returning to the exact same corporate target over and over. That's not opportunistic. That's a deliberate decision by Ukrainian military planners that this specific piece of civilian-sounding infrastructure carries real strategic weight worth spending expensive long-range drones on, night after night, even as the company keeps insisting to its customers that everything remains under control. And it's worth noting that Ukraine hasn't only stopped at warehouses. Reports have described strikes escalating toward the banking side of this same network too, the financial arm that helps move money through the Russian state budget, which tells you this campaign is widening rather than winding down. Wildberries is reportedly now scrambling, with some reports suggesting the company is even exploring warehouse space across the border in neighboring countries, hoping distance might offer protection that Russian air defense clearly hasn't been able to provide. But here's where the story turns from a business problem into something closer to a genuine financial crisis. Wildberries carried enormous debts to Russian state banks before any of this started, and its banking arm has already drawn scrutiny from European regulators over its financial ties to the Russian state budget. Now, with warehouses destroyed and inventory gone, the company is edging closer to real financial trouble. And when a company that large owes that much money and suddenly can't keep up, the damage doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Stop and think about why. A major state-linked bank would agree to delay loan repayments for struggling companies connected to this network. Banks don't offer that kind of leniency out of kindness. They do it because they understand the alternative is worse. If enough companies default on their loans at the same moment, the banks holding those loans could face a liquidity problem of their own. There's an old saying that fits perfectly here. If you owe the bank a small amount of money and can't pay, that's your problem. If you owe the bank an enormous amount of money and can't pay, that becomes the bank's problem. Right now, across parts of the Russian economy, that problem is multiplying. It's worth pausing to think about who actually gets hurt first here. Not the generals, not the officials making decisions about the war. It's small business owners, warehouse workers with no shifts to show up for, families who built modest online shops through platforms like Wildberries over years, only to watch their stock disappear overnight. These are not the architects of this war. They're simply standing closest to its economic shockwaves. That, in essence, is the quiet brutality of economic warfare. It moves from a burned warehouse to an unpaid loan, from an unpaid loan to a nervous bank, from a nervous bank to tighter lending across an entire country, all while other sectors of the Russian economy are already slowing down hard. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because this is where things get genuinely alarming for Moscow. Russia's government has been running a substantial budget deficit this year, a gap that, when measured against the country's available liquid reserves, paints an uncomfortable picture. Russia's planned defense budget for the year sits at a level several times larger than what actually remains in its reserve funds, and analysts expect additional emergency military spending on top of that. Spending that alone could equal more than the entire remaining reserve fund. Add it all together, and total Russian war spending since the invasion began has now crossed a truly staggering figure, hundreds of billions of dollars. Here's a simpler way to think about the scale of that number. For every dollar of spendable reserve Russia has left, it has already spent many multiples of that fighting this war. That's not a nation confidently marching toward victory. That's a nation burning through its savings at a genuinely alarming speed, hoping something changes before the money runs out completely. Consider what that kind of spending pace actually forces a government to do behind the scenes. Quietly, away from the cameras and the state television broadcasts, reserve funds don't refill themselves overnight, and a war that consumes resources at multiples of what's coming in eventually forces uncomfortable choices, cutting other government programs, squeezing regional budgets, or reaching further into the accounts of ordinary citizens. None of those options are politically comfortable, and all of them tend to show up eventually as the kind of quiet domestic tension that's much harder to hide than a battlefield setback ever was. To put this in everyday terms, imagine a household spending more than 10 times its entire savings just to keep up appearances. No family survives that long without something breaking. A country isn't so different. It just has more tools available to delay the reckoning and more ways to hide the pain for a little while longer. Russia has used those tools before. During earlier waves of sanctions, the government leaned on wealth funds, currency controls, and trade redirected toward friendlier countries. Those strategies bought time. They didn't solve the underlying problem. And now the room to maneuver is shrinking fast. Before we go further into how deep this crisis is cutting into ordinary Russian families, take a moment right now and comment below with one word describing how surprised you are by these numbers, because it genuinely helps this kind of grounded breakdown reach more people who are still hearing the opposite story. Now back to the numbers, because they're about to hit much closer to home for millions of ordinary Russians. When a government runs low on money, it has choices to make. It can cut spending, it can raise taxes, or it can quietly start looking at the money sitting in its own citizens' bank accounts. Russia appears to be leaning toward that last option. New rules have reportedly been introduced, giving Russian banks far more power to restrict how much money depositors can withdraw. In simple terms, the legal guarantee that your money is instantly and fully accessible whenever you want it is being quietly weakened. Banks are gaining more legal room to slow down or limit withdrawals, especially large ones. Why would a government do this? Because officials can see what's coming. A country moving toward broader military mobilization tends to create a very natural reaction in its population. People want access to their savings. They want the ability to move money, convert it to a stable foreign currency, or simply have cash on hand in case they need to leave quickly. A government worried about capital flight and bank runs has a strong incentive to keep money trapped inside its financial system, locked in local currency, unable to easily escape. For Russian families, this creates a quiet but very real form of fear. Save your whole life, work hard, build a modest financial cushion, and now face the real possibility that accessing it might not be as simple as walking into a bank anymore. Combine that anxiety with rising talk of expanded conscription, and you get a population growing uneasy in ways that are genuinely hard for any government to fully control. Picture an ordinary family, far from Moscow, a father working at a factory, a mother managing a household budget, 2 teenage sons approaching the age where a mobilization notice could reach their door. For that family, abstract statistics about deficits and reserves become deeply personal. It becomes a question of whether a knock on the door means a summons to the front line. This is the quiet undercurrent beneath every official statement coming out of the Kremlin right now. Officials talk about stability and resilience, but adaptation and desperation can look remarkably similar from the outside. And the policies being rolled out, tighter withdrawal restrictions, expanding conscription, harsher penalties for draft evasion, tell a very different story than the confident narrative playing out on state television. There's a reason authoritarian governments lean so heavily on controlling information during moments like this. When ordinary citizens can't easily compare notes with each other, When independent journalism is suppressed and dissent carries real legal risk, fear becomes easier to manage from the top down. But fear managed from the top is still fear. It still erodes trust. It still pushes capital toward the exits, whether that capital is money quietly converted into foreign currency, or simply people quietly deciding that leaving the country is safer than staying to find out. What happens next? This is the part that connects everything together, so stay with us here, because this is the moment where economic pressure starts turning into a genuinely dangerous political decision. A leader facing a shrinking treasury, a nervous population, and a military struggling to keep pace on the battlefield needs something to shift the national conversation. Something that redirects fear away from empty reserves and toward an external threat instead. Something that justifies tighter control, harsher restrictions, and a public more willing to accept sacrifice because they believe a bigger danger is standing at the door. And that brings us to Poland. A Russian missile crossed into Polish airspace during a massive overnight strike on Ukraine, landing in a rural area near the border, deep enough that it can't be dismissed as some accidental drift. NATO forces scrambled fighter jets, an attack helicopter, and additional aircraft in response, activating ground defenses across the region. This wasn't the first time Russian aircraft or drones have tested NATO airspace either. It's happened before, quietly, repeatedly, almost as if Moscow is running a series of experiments to see exactly how far it can push before facing real consequences. And so far, the consequences have stayed limited. Strong statements, diplomatic protests, warnings, but nothing that has meaningfully changed Russian behavior. What makes this particular incident feel different is the type of weapon involved. Earlier incursions into NATO airspace largely involved drones, cheap, slow-moving, relatively easy to explain away as navigation errors or jamming interference. This time, it was reportedly a long-range cruise missile, a weapon that doesn't drift accidentally off course the way a small drone might. European officials were quick to describe the episode as proof that Russian aggression threatens the security of the entire continent, not just Ukraine. A crater was found in a field near the border, a stark physical reminder that the line separating this war from a wider European conflict is thinner than most people would like to admit. Here's why that pattern matters so much right now. An incident like this does two very convenient things for a leader under pressure at home. First, it hands him a powerful tool for his own population. Suddenly, the story isn't about failing refineries or restricted bank withdrawals. It becomes about a supposedly aggressive NATO alliance edging closer to Russian interests, a narrative that can justify tighter domestic control, expanded conscription, and harsher restrictions, all wrapped in the language of national defense. Second, it puts pressure directly on the alliance currently supplying Ukraine with the weapons burning down those Russian refineries. If NATO countries grow nervous enough about direct confrontation, if public opinion in the West starts questioning continued military support for Ukraine, that hesitation becomes Moscow's best hope for slowing down the very strikes that are dismantling its economy piece by piece. Because, make no mistake, weaker Western support for Ukraine is one of the only realistic paths left for Russia to relieve the pressure it's currently under. The battlefield isn't offering Moscow a breakthrough. The economy isn't offering relief. The only lever left to pull is trying to fracture the resolve of the countries supporting Ukraine from the outside. This is why a provocation near Poland shouldn't be viewed as a random, isolated event. It fits into a larger pattern of a government trying to convert battlefield losses and economic desperation into political leverage, using fear as a substitute for strength it no longer fully has. There's also a colder, more calculated layer here. Every time Russia probes NATO airspace and faces no meaningful cost, it learns exactly where the threshold sits, how far it can push before the alliance responds with more than a statement. That's not accidental, it's method. Each time the response stays limited to words, the next probe tends to go a little further. A missile landing inside Polish territory today doesn't guarantee restraint tomorrow. It's far more likely to be treated as a green light than a warning. For NATO members, this creates a genuinely uncomfortable dilemma. Respond too softly, and the pattern of testing continues, each incursion slightly bolder than the one before. Respond too aggressively, and Moscow gets exactly the confrontation it can use to justify total mobilization at home. Finding the right balance between firm deterrence and avoiding unnecessary escalation is one of the hardest calculations any alliance can face, and it's precisely the kind of uncertainty a struggling regime hopes to exploit. If you're starting to see just how connected all of these pieces really are, the burning refineries, the collapsing warehouses, the tightening bank restrictions, and now a missile landing deep inside NATO territory, take a second and hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to connect these dots clearly without spin, so you actually understand what's happening instead of just reacting to headlines. Now let's talk about what this actually means going forward, because understanding the pieces only matters if we understand where they're leading. Russia today is not operating from a position of strength. A country confident in its military and economic future doesn't need to threaten its own citizens with restricted bank withdrawals. It doesn't need to send weapons drifting into the airspace of a nuclear-armed defensive alliance just to generate a domestic distraction. Those are the actions of a government trying to manage decline, not a government marching toward victory. Every dollar Russia spends defending refineries that keep burning down anyway is a dollar it can't spend on offensive operations. Every warehouse destroyed adds another company to the list of businesses begging banks for repayment relief. Every delayed loan payment adds pressure to an already fragile banking system. And every restriction placed on ordinary citizens' savings chips away just a little more at the quiet trust that keeps any financial system functioning at all. None of this guarantees an immediate collapse. Governments under economic strain have survived for years, sometimes decades, by squeezing their populations harder and controlling information more tightly. Russia has significant tools available to delay a full-blown crisis. State media can shape the narrative. Financial regulations can buy time. Selective repression can suppress open dissent. But there's a real difference between delaying collapse and reversing decline. Right now, Russia appears to be managing the first, while struggling badly at the second. And that distinction matters enormously for how this war likely unfolds from here. A country fighting to win looks for opportunities to expand, to break through, to seize new advantages. A country fighting to survive looks for ways to freeze the situation in place, to buy time, to wear down its opponent's patience rather than defeat its opponent's army. Everything we've walked through today points toward the second version of Russia, a Kremlin managing crisis after crisis, hoping that Western unity cracks before Russian reserves run completely dry, hoping that a provocation near Poland creates enough hesitation abroad to offset the fires burning at home. The real question isn't really about Russia's intentions anymore. Those intentions are becoming clearer by the week. The real question is about everyone else watching this unfold. Will the countries supporting Ukraine understand what a provocation like this missile crossing into Polish airspace actually represents? A sign of weakness disguised as aggression, rather than backing away from support at the exact moment it's proving most effective? Because if the numbers we just walked through tell us anything, it's this: the strategy of hitting Russia's economic foundations, its refineries, its logistics networks, its financial institutions, is working. It's not a theory. It's showing up in refining output, in loan default requests, in reserve funds shrinking faster than anyone in Moscow likely projected. Wars aren't only won on battlefields, they're won in budgets, in banks, in the quiet moment when a government realizes it can no longer afford to keep fighting the way it has been. Russia is edging closer to that moment with every burning refinery and every restricted bank withdrawal. History shows this pattern again and again. Empires and regimes that looked unshakable from the outside, while the numbers underneath were already telling a completely different story. A desperate move near a NATO border doesn't change that underlying reality. If anything, it confirms it. A confident government doesn't need distractions or gambles with an alliance capable of responding decisively in a single, coordinated moment. Only a government that feels the walls closing in reaches for a move that risky. So here's where we'll leave things today. A regime that once spoke confidently about total victory is now managing restricted withdrawals, rationing access to citizens' own savings, and gambling with airspace. Incursions near one of the most powerful military alliances on Earth. That's not the behavior of a winner. That's the behavior of a government trying to buy itself just a little more time. Whether that time runs out sooner or later depends heavily on what happens next, both on the battlefield and in the decisions being made in capitals far away from the front lines. History has a habit of remembering these moments more clearly than the people living through them ever do. Years from now, when this war gets studied in classrooms and written about in books, this exact stretch of time may be remembered as a genuine turning point. The moment refineries stopped rebuilding faster than they burned. The moment banks stopped being able to quietly absorb every bad loan. The moment ordinary Russians stopped fully believing the promises coming from state television and started asking harder questions about where their money and their sons were actually going. No empire in history has ever collapsed from a single dramatic blow. They erode. They crack slowly in places nobody is watching closely enough until the cracks connect and the whole structure gives way at once. A burned refinery here, a delayed loan repayment there, a restricted withdrawal in one city, a quiet conscription notice in another, individually manageable. Together, they outline a system running out of road. And that's exactly why a reckless missile crossing into Polish airspace matters so much right now. It isn't a sign of confidence. It's a flare sent up by a government that knows exactly how thin the ice beneath it has become, hoping. The flash of danger distracts everyone at home and abroad from noticing just how close that ice is to breaking completely. There's something bigger at stake here too. The way this war ends will shape how every future conflict gets fought and financed. If economic pressure and precision strikes prove capable of bringing a major military power to its knees without a single foreign soldier crossing the border, that lesson won't be lost on governments watching from other capitals around the world, capitals with their own ambitions, their own rivals, and their own calculations about what a modern war might actually cost them. This is turning into a preview of how power itself might be contested in the decades ahead. That's exactly why the next few months matter so much. Every refinery that stays offline, every loan that goes unpaid, every family quietly moving savings into foreign currency adds another layer of pressure onto a system that's already struggling to hold itself together. And every response, or lack of response, to a provocation like the one near Poland sends its own message, one that either strengthens Moscow's gamble or exposes exactly how weak that gamble really is. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening beneath the headlines, make sure you're subscribed. Drop a comment telling us how you think this war ends, and share this video with someone who still believes Russia holds the upper hand. The truth deserves a bigger audience than the propaganda does. Keep watching closely, because stories like this rarely stay quiet for long. New reports come in every week, new numbers, new strikes, new signs of a system straining under its own weight, quietly cracking in places most headlines never bother to look. What looks like a slow, grinding conflict from the outside is actually one of the fastest moving economic pressure campaigns any modern power has faced in years. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.